Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and in celebration of the March Equinox, which is considered to be a worm moon, which is really interesting. It's a very powerful moon, they're saying, and there's also solar flare activity happening at the moment, and that is going to intensify energy on the planet. I have felt definitely inspired to speak of the New Zealand issues and the conflicts around the world, and to try and, I guess, enter the conversation of our willingness to accept violence and really the state of play in politics, the state of play in government, how it works. So what I'm going to do is read from a book that inspired my life. I may or may not tell you the source at the end, but let's just put it to you as food for thought. It's to get you thinking about the world you're in. Why this is important at this time is because there's massive change happening, and people are very confused by what appears to be very frightening situations occurring. The real fear of a loss of liberty, loss of democracy, changes in government, public relations, wars still continuing in the 21st century, the sense of being stuck in paradigms that are not serving us ultimately. They're certainly not serving us at this time, but if they continue, I do think the survival of the planet is at stake. And this is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, is because I'm driven by a very strong sense of love for humanity. Is my truth the truth? I'm reading and writing what I resonate with. I seek to, gather, if you like, sources that I feel are good sources based on my own research. I'm not an expert in government. I'm not an expert in counterterrorism. I'm not an expert really in public policy. Where I have specific strengths is that I'm very moved by inspiration. I have an economics background. I'm a market analyst. So I have got some expertise around why we do what we do in respect of markets and economics. I also have expertise in peace, education, and my life is very much governed by a philosophy of real hope, real hopes actually in my case as the model, which is an acronym for responsibility, empathy, awareness, love, honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment, and service. So my life is dedicated to peace. I dreamed I was teaching peace back in 1998. I woke up, I actually had a dream, and I rang a friend of mine who was a teacher, and I said, does anybody teach peace? And he says, well, we have peace. So social studies was what he said in the curriculum, but there was no dedicated subject to peace. Peace has often been relegated as idealistic. You might sort of articulate it like it's peace activists, anti-government. It's not. Or you might look at the other side of it and see it as Buddhist, people just breathing in and out, meditating, but not really doing a great deal. The truth about peace is that it is who we are when we deal with our internal and external conflict. You can change the word from peace to harmony. Harmony is actually a stronger word in the sense that we work in harmony with life. So what you resist persists, what you look at disappears. You go into the flow of life, you're not fighting life. You're not righteous in respect of your belief systems. You're open to considering different perspectives because everyone has a right to see life in their own way. From a peace perspective, there is an educational point of view because once people start to understand their own inner conflict, they'll be able to be in a position to resolve outer conflict. All external conflict is arising from inner conflict. That is unquestioned. We carry belief systems from centuries where our grandparents, their grandparents, their grandparents' grandparents have carried belief systems down. And because we're born into this life and we're educated in this way, we've never really been in a position to question it. Basically, it's been a tacit consent that's been created around us. There's a fear-based narrative around it that if you contravene the rules, if you speak up, you're seen as an activist rather than a Democrat, which is rather interesting. There tends to be a negative judgment of people who speak up, whereas from a democratic perspective, that's actually encouraged. In those agoras, back in the Greek agoras, where the senators used to stand up, there was a whole range of them that debated, and that's where debate came from, was being visible, was putting a perspective, was clashing up ideas, and the idea there was to solve problems. What we're seeing today is increasing censure or people being excluded from the debate as they're not experts or professors. So the mainstream itself is fairly silent on many matters because they're not able to find their voice. Although the internet has opened up real possibilities for people to communicate with their friends and wider audiences. So it is really starting to blossom, providing the censorship doesn't impede viewpoints that those who regard themselves in positions of power don't agree with. Of course, I'm an advocate for not promoting violence in any form on the internet. I do believe there has to be a code of conduct that you would expect from businesses, from organisations, and in respect of personal conduct. There has to be an agreed code of conduct so that we're not inflaming disputation around the world, that we're not disrespectful. But having said that, many people don't know how to communicate effectively. Many people have not been taught conflict resolution. Many people for the first time are clashing it up with those who totally disagree with them. So they're learning to go through a process of frustration and anger at being confronted with viewpoints very different from their own. So there is great benefit in that too, because you have to consider your own beliefs when someone challenges you. And I think that to me is a universal form of democracy. Whether you adhere to democratic systems or not doesn't really matter. It's really about getting people to communicate and to talk to each other. But I don't believe it's healthy to have violent images on the net or sexualising women on the net. Just as a very brief interlude, we had a female footballer who a photo was posted on Facebook, and she was kicking a ball and her leg was very high. I didn't read what had been stated about her, but it was sexualised. And of course, women are really frustrated and annoyed at hearing that women are always seen in this way. And that's because it's constantly put in front of people. We have movies that constantly place women in the space of victim or weak or over-emotional. These are untrue depictions of females. Yes, some might feel like that, but then you get men like that too. It creates crimes. In the courts, certainly my understanding of the courts here in Victoria, the majority of crimes are sex-related crimes. So it's a real issue for women. That sort of thing should not be posted on the net. But having said that, I do believe discussions need to happen around prostitution. Discussions need to happen around child trafficking. Discussions need to happen around pedophilia. Discussions need to happen around violence, around warfare, around corruption. On the one hand. On the other hand, there has to be discussions about happiness, discussions about purpose, discussions about interests, hobbies, things that bring the joy of life to all of us. So I'm not certainly opposed to the diverse conversations. I think they have to happen. I'm all for open dialogue and visibility, because that's when we're in a position to actually tackle things, and we also can see where our own prejudices lie. So that's really just a bit of an overview into peace and where I'm coming from. So I'm going to read you out of this book. Some of it's going to be confronting for sure, but I believe it's worth having a look at. As I said, it's from a very interesting source, we'll put it that way. It is a dialogue. I may read some of the person's questions in it, and the answers I will read. I'll start with the response being from this, I'll call it a higher source. Even broader perspective could be more accurate. It says, no questions are undeserving or unworthy. Questions are like people. And this guy goes, oh, good one. Okay, then let me ask, is it wrong to undertake a foreign policy based on your country's own vested interests? The broader perspective states, no, first, from my standpoint, nothing is wrong, but I understand how you use the term, so I will speak within the context of your vocabulary. I'll use the term wrong to mean that which is not serving you, given who and what you choose to be. I want to repeat that because that's very powerful. For many people, the concept of no right and wrong would be thrown out immediately as can't be true. But within this context is that which does not serve you. Because we might have something right in a Western culture, it could be wrong in an Eastern culture. So a more accurate way of saying is that which is not serving you, given who and what you're choosing to be. This is how I've always used the term right and wrong with you. It's always within this context, for in truth there is no right and wrong. So within that context, no, it is not wrong to base foreign policy decisions on vested interest considerations. Yeah, which is interesting, isn't it? What is wrong is to pretend that you're not doing so. Okay, if we're going to use the word wrong, that's when it's deceptive. This most countries do, of course. They take action or fail to take action for one set of reasons, then given as a rationale another set of reasons. And he says, why do countries do that? Because governments know that if people understood the real reasons for most foreign policy decisions, the people would not support them. This is true of governments everywhere. There are very few governments which do not deliberately mislead their people. Deception is part of government. Few people would choose to be governed the way they are governed. Few would choose to be governed at all unless government convinced them that its decisions were for their own good. This is hard convincing, for most people plainly see the foolishness in government. So government must lie to at least try to hold the people's loyalty. Government is the perfect portrayer of the accuracy of the axiom that if you lie big enough, long enough, the lie becomes the truth. People in power must never let the public know how they came to power, nor all that they have done and are willing to do to stay there. Truth and politics do not and cannot mix, because politics is the art of saying only what needs to be said and saying it in just the right way in order to achieve a desired end. Not all politics are bad, but the art of politics is a practical art. It recognises with great candour the psychology of most people. It simply notices that most people operate out of self-interest. So politics is the way that people of power seek to convince you that their self-interest is your own. Originally, governments had very limited functions. Their purpose was simply to preserve and protect. Then someone added provide. When governments began to be the people's provider, as well as the people's protector, government started creating society rather than preserving it. And he goes on to say, aren't governments simply doing what people want? Don't they provide the mechanism which the people provide for themselves on a social scale? Talks about the United States, talks about laws, asking governments to create programs to provide income for the elderly, ensure equal employment and housing opportunities for all people, lifestyles, to guarantee through child labour laws that a nation's children don't become nation slaves and so forth, that the family with children does not go without basics in respect of dignity, food, clothing and shelter. High Perspectives response is, such laws reflect well upon your society, yet in providing for people's needs, you must be careful not to rob them of their greatest dignity, the exercise of personal power, individual creativity, and the single-minded ingenuity which allows people to notice that they can provide for themselves. Some might call that self-reliance. It is a delicate balance which must be struck. You people seem to know only how to go from one extreme to the other. Either you want government to do it all for the people, or you want to kill all government programs and erase all government laws tomorrow. And then he sort of responds to that. He talks about other discriminations and inequalities existing on a massive scale. High Perspective answers, governments then must replace the conscience of the people as a question. No, and he says, no, governments are the people's conscience, outspoken. It is through governments that people seek hope and determine to correct the ills of society. High Perspective says, that is well said. Yet I repeat, you must take care not to smother yourself in laws, trying to guarantee people a chance to breathe. You cannot legislate morality. You cannot mandate equality. What is needed is a shift of collective consciousness, not an enforcer of collective conscience. Behaviour, and in brackets, and all laws and all government programs must spring from beingness, must be a true reflection of who you are. And of course, beingness is really being in the present moment, being who you are is what they're stating, or what it's stating. So when I do what I do, I'm not doing it on the beckoning of other people. I'm coming from a space of being, well-being, being here now, authenticity. He goes on to say, the laws of our society do reflect who we are. They say to everyone, this is how it is here, in this case in America. This is who Americans are. High Perspective responds, in the best of cases perhaps, but more often than not, your laws are the announcements of what those in power think you should be, but are not. He then says, the elitist few instruct the ignorant many through the law. The answer is precisely. Yeah, right, interesting. He then says, what's wrong with that? If there are a few of the brightest and best amongst us willing to look at the problems of society, of the world, and propose solutions, does that not serve the many? Higher Perspective answers, it depends on the motives of those few and on their clarity. Generally, nothing serves the many more than letting them govern themselves. And that few won't want to hear that. He then says, anarchy, it never worked. High Perspective says, you cannot grow and become great when you are constantly being told what to do by the government. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I've certainly never been able to do what I wanted to do when I've gone under authority of others. It was only when I decided to follow my heart that my life purpose opened up. I would never have become a peace clown and travelled the world. I would never have studied non-violence. I would never have done peace studies or alternative to violence. I'd never have become a poet or a philosopher had I not made the decision to really come out of my own sovereignty. And that's not necessarily meaning rebelling against authority. It's just meaning becoming your own authority. And from my perspective, that's going with the heart, speaking the truth, doing what it takes to achieve what you feel your purpose is in life. So he goes on to say, this is the man, it would be argued that governments, by that I mean the law by which we've chosen to govern ourselves, is a reflection of society's greatness, or lack thereof, that great societies pass great laws. High Perspective says, and very few of them, for in great societies very few laws are necessary. How interesting is that? In great societies, few laws. I don't think there's a lot of lawyers at the top. And of course, these societies that are being referred to here are not necessarily here on the planet. Some of them might have been earlier civilizations, like the Maya. I don't know how many laws they had, but some of the tribal societies tended to follow, I'm thinking of Indigenous here in Australia, universal law, dreaming, more tribal law, but they wouldn't have been passing legislation every week. More and more controls. And it gets really convoluted. It's like, well, what happens when innocent people get caught up in all that? So he says, still truly lawless societies are primitive societies where might is right. Law is a man's attempt to level the playing field, to ensure that what is truly right will prevail, weakness or strength notwithstanding. Without codes of behaviour upon which we mutually agree, how could we coexist? Good question. High Perspective says, I'm not suggesting a world with no codes of behaviour, no agreements. I'm suggesting that your agreements and codes be based on a higher understanding and a grander definition of self-interest. What most laws actually do say is what the most powerful among you have as their vested interest. Let's just look at one example, smoking. Now, the law says you cannot grow and use a certain kind of plant, hemp, because so government tells you it's not good for you. Yet the same government says it's all right to grow and use another kind of plant, tobacco, not because it's good for you, indeed the government itself says it's bad, but presumably because you've always done so. The real reason that the first plant is outlawed and the second plant is not has nothing to do with health. It has to do with economics, and that is to say, power. Your laws, therefore, do not reflect what your society thinks of itself and wishes to be. Your laws reflect where the power is. He says, no, fair, you picked a situation where the contradictions are apparent. Most situations are not like that. High Perspective says, on the contrary, most are. He says, then what is the solution? The answer is to have a few laws, which are really limits. To have as few laws, which are really limits, as possible. So we'd need to go in and carve out all that legislation that's unnecessary. The reason the first weed is outlawed is only ostensibly about health. The truth is the first weed is no more addictive and no more of a health risk than cigarettes or alcohol, both of which are protected by law. Why is it then not allowed? Because if it were grown, half the cotton growers, nylon and rayon manufacturers and timber product people in the world would go out of business. Hemp happens to be one of the most useful, strong, toughest, longest lasting materials on your planet. You cannot produce a better fibre for clothes, a stronger substance for ropes, an easier to grow and harvest source for pulp. You cut down hundreds of thousands of trees per year to give yourself Sunday papers. so that you can read about the decimation of the world's forests. Hemp could provide you with millions of Sunday papers without cutting down one tree. Indeed, it could substitute for so many resource materials at 1/10 of the cost. And that is the catch. Somebody loses money. If this miraculous plant, which also has extraordinary medicinal properties, incidentally, is allowed to be grown. And this is why marijuana is illegal in your country. It is the same reason you have taken so long to mass produce electric cars, provide affordable, sensible healthcare, or use solar heat and solar power in every home. You've had the wherewithal and the technology to produce all of these things for years. Why then do you not have them? Look to see who would lose money if you did. There you will find your answers. This is the great society of which you are so proud. Your great society has been dragged kicking and screaming to consider the common good. Whenever common good or collective good is mentioned, everyone yells communism. In your society, if providing for the good of the many does not produce a huge profit for someone, the good of the many is more often than not ignored. This is true not only in your country, but also around the world. The basic question facing humankind, therefore, is, can self-interest ever be replaced by best interests? The common interest of humankind. If so, how? In the United States, you have tried to provide for the common interest, the best interest through laws. You have failed miserably. That's pretty blunt. Your nation is the richest, most powerful on the earth, and it has one of the highest infant mortality rates. Why? Because poor people cannot afford quality prenatal and postnatal care. And your society is profit-driven. I cite this as just one example of your miserable failure. Ooh, coming down hard. The fact that your babies are dying at a higher rate than most other industrialized nations in the world should bother you. It does not. That says volumes about where your priorities are as a society. Other countries provide for the sick and the needy, the elderly and infirm. You provide for the rich and wealthy, the influential and the well-placed. 85% of retired Americans live in poverty. I have to say I was very shocked to read that. Many of these older Americans and most people on low income use the local hospital emergency room as their family doctor seeking medical treatment under only the most dire of circumstances and receiving virtually no preventative health maintenance care at all. There's no profit, you see, in people who have little to spend. They've worn out their usefulness, and this is your great society. Yeah, I have to say when I read that, I completely concurred with that, and I consider it outrageous that people on private health insurance are actually paying for the right to survive over people who are poor. So if you get cancer, you get immediate treatment. If you're poor, you don't. I mean, that's an inequality that's unbelievable in wealthy countries. I mean, how can it be made to sit okay within you to know that someone, just by the fact that they've got no money, can't get treated? I mean, I was really lucky last Christmas I had cancer. I was lucky. We have Medicare here. I was also lucky I was on the welfare system, because I may not have been able to access cancer treatment. That's something I'd have to investigate, but I was able to get treated for cancer for free. I know in Canada they also have free healthcare, and I would expect New Zealand would too. These are the signs, in my view, of civilised societies. This is where egalitarianism creates a fairness. No person should die because they're poor. When I became homeless and unemployed, I've been fascinated at the way I was treated. And I'm still looking at it with great interest because I'm the same person. If I was working as a market analyst or an economist, my status goes up. And I can see that if I'm articulate like I am, I get treated differently. Once people get an idea of my status, the demeanour changes actually towards me. And what I've seen is if I'm not on social security here, I don't have access to anything. So I can be homeless with no money and fall between the cracks. Now, when I've communicated this to people in authority, there's been no empathy whatsoever, no follow-up, nothing. That sent warning bells through me as a peacemaker, and I realised that there's a major disconnect, and there are really, really deep prejudices around the Protestant work ethic, which is deeply embedded in Western culture. It's come from the United Kingdom in actual fact, but it sort of underlines the idea that when you work, you're a decent person. When you don't work, you're somehow a loser or you are bludgeoning off the system. There's a really negative propaganda generated around less than full employment, which is it's not possible to generate full employment unless work is somehow restructured into job share or, where everybody can access work. Sweden and Finland have very, very good social policies and safety nets where a person who's unemployed, I believe last time I looked, it was around 2/3 of the full-time wage they were paid. So they're not suffering the inequality that would happen in places like, certainly in Australia, but the third world is even more stark because they may not be even able to access a welfare system. But nonetheless, there is inequality, social inequality, as a result of a perception of value accorded to a person based on their income. So those retirees in the United States, 85% are in great poverty. Well, that's not a respect to the elders who have worked their whole lives in that system. And for those on low income, they have to go to emergency and wait 6 to 8 hours, maybe overnight, in order to get some treatment instead of being able to go to their local doctor. When you're in pain, the last thing you want to be doing is sitting in an emergency waiting room. Compassion would ensure that you get treated immediately, as you would any family member. And that's where self-interest is completely disconnected from best interest. Those are examples of it. And he says, you make things sound pretty bad, yet America has done more for the underprivileged and the unfortunate, both here and abroad, than any other nation on earth. Broader perspective states, America has done much that is observably true. Yet do you know that as a percentage of its gross national product, the United States provides proportionately less for foreign aid than many much smaller countries? The point is that before you allow yourself to become too self-congratulatory, perhaps you should look at the world around you. For if this is the best your world can do for the less fortunate, you all have much to learn. You live in a wasteful, decadent society. You've built into virtually everything you make what your engineers call planned obsolescence. Cars cost 3 times as much and last 1/3 as long. Clothes fall apart after the 10th wearing. You put chemicals in your food so they can stay on the shelf longer, even if it means your stay on the planet is shorter. You support, encourage and enable sports teams to pay obscene salaries for ridiculous efforts, while teachers, ministers and researchers fighting to find a cure for the diseases which kill you go begging for money. You throw away more food each day in your nation's supermarkets, restaurants and homes than it would take to feed half the world. Yet this is not an indictment, merely an observation, and not of the United States alone, for the attitudes that sicken the heart are epidemic around the world. The underprivileged everywhere must grovel and scrimp to merely stay alive. while the few in power protect and increase great hoards of cash, lie on sheets of silk, and each morning twist bathroom fixtures made of gold. And as emaciated children of ribs and skin die in the arms of weeping mothers, their country's leaders engage in political corruption, which keeps donated foodstuffs from reaching the starving masses. No one seems to have the power to alter these conditions, yet the truth is, power is not the problem. No one seems to have the will. And thus it will always be so long as no one sees another's plight as his or her own. I'll just wade in here. The reason I take the risks I take in speaking my truth, living the way I live, is because I do see others' plights as my own. When I've spoken up in the past about abuse, I've done it not because of my own vested interests. I've done it because I didn't want other people following me to be abused. I've always felt very, very strong sense of social responsibility, which is why I speak my truth. When I was in the welfare system and I saw abuses happening within the system, and I saw that the system was not serving the unemployed, when I started to recognise the activities were really more, in my opinion, about enslaving people to activity as some sort of mutual obligation for receiving social security, which in our country has been a safety net. It was social welfare, social security. The term got changed into job seeker was the person, and income support became the benefit. These are all changes in words, but they highlight an economic paradigm that got laid over welfare, and at the basis of that, you shouldn't get money for nothing. What wasn't understood by the framers of that was that a social safety net is not money for nothing. It's to help people survive so they're not on the street, so they're not stealing, so they're not in absolute desperation like our forefathers were, who were the convicts, who were petty criminals in England, often from Wales, Scotland, Ireland. So the forefathers of those of us in Australia were petty criminals because they were the poorest of the poor who were stealing to survive, and they got sent to Australia as punishment on convict ships. Many of them perished actually en route because the ship owners had no empathy whatsoever. They got scurvy. They locked them in down below deck. Many of them died. No compassion. Delivered them to Australia. Most of them were dead until the ones transporting them decided to give incentives to those ship owners to bring them alive. One would think conscience would have had compassion, ensured those people were arriving safely. But there seems to be something missing within the human condition, that empathy isn't there, and there seems to be a need for a payment in order to create that incentive to care for others. So my people, in a sense, have come from that class, that lower class, that were treated abysmally in the United Kingdom, or in Britain at that time. UK, it would have been Great Britain at that time. So we've had this great schism for quite a long time, where people have not considered the plight of another as their own, is the point I'm making. He goes on to say, because you do not care, oh no, this is high perspective. Because you do not care, it is a lack of caring. The entire planet faces a crisis of consciousness. That's why we're in the times we're in now. That's why these wars have been endless, because no one's caring enough about those suffering on the ground. And that idea of it being a left wing, that's just propaganda. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a human response. When you feel, you're going to rise up and say something. Now, those who are in denial can typecast that other as sitting somewhere along the political spectrum, but that's just game word playing, wordsmithing, in order to demonise that other and to create further division. The truth makes you look at yourself, which may be painful for those who have not cared, and then come to realise the consequence of that situation imposed on others. And that can be very painful to awaken, to see your own cruelty and unkindness. It's not popular. So high perspective talks about the entire planet facing a crisis of consciousness. You must decide whether you simply care for each other. See, in my work as a peace clown, and even as a child, you know, like this was very much deeply embedded in me as a child. I could never understand why people hurt each other. I used to, as a child, cry. If I saw someone hurt, I'd cry. But what I noted, that when I was hurt, no one was crying. Darn it, I was the only one. But I was always aware of other people. So, you know, having said that, I'm also very conscious of those who don't care. You don't know what you don't know. And I often say that because it really is an awareness. It's like, how can I blame someone for not caring when they don't care? They obviously don't feel anything. If you don't feel anything, you're not going to react. But perhaps if we can bring it to the attention of that those people who are not caring, consequence, they may then look at their behaviour and make changes. Now, that may not evoke within them a deeper feeling of compassion. It may not. But at least could perhaps evoke rules, codes of conduct, peer pressure around that to ensure that harm doesn't occur. So as Source, or this high perspective says, you must decide whether you simply care for each other. What do all the religions say? Love each other. Love your neighbour as yourself. These are the values that have been put out by religion. Mercy, compassion for orphans. So then he says, it seems such a pathetic question to have to ask. Why can't we love the members of our own family? High perspective says you do love the members of your own family. You simply have a very limited view of who your family members are. You do not consider yourself part of the human family, and so the problems of the human family are not your own. And that's, of course, where I differ from others. I really see, and it's just something I've always known and felt. I've felt my own pain has always been reflective of the broader community. Even when I've had pain on a monthly basis, really severe pain to the point where you think you're going to die, it can be really bad. You men are so lucky. I always use that pain to feel empathy for humanity. I always used it. When I suffered, I thought, well, what about all the suffering people in the world? You know, you're feeling this pain and you're suffering. Really sit with the suffering of others. And that was the way I deepened my own ability to empathise with humanity as myself. You are me. I did that through that intense pain, because I used to get really intense pain. I'm free of it now. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Goes on to say, and how can the peoples of the earth change their worldview? That depends on what you want to change it to. He says, how can we eliminate more of the pain, more of the suffering? High perspective says, by eliminating all separations between you, by constructing a new model of the world, by holding it within the framework of a new idea. When I read that, I thought of Real Hope, my work, as a new model. Responsibility, empathy, awareness, love, honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment. I always tack on a S on the end as the model, Real Hopes, because service is a natural state of being. It's not doing good, it's a state of being. when you integrate universal values which are inherent within every human being. So he says which is, and he's referring to which model. High Perspective says which is going to be a radical departure from the present worldview. Presently, you see the world, we're speaking geopolitically now, as a collective of nation states, each sovereign, separate and independent of each other. The internal problems of these independent nation states are, by and large, not considered the problems of the group as a whole. Unless and until they affect the group as a whole, and in brackets, or the most powerful members of that group, close brackets, the group as a whole reacts to the conditions and problems of individual states based on the vested interests of the larger group. If no one in the larger group has anything to lose, conditions in an individual state could go to hell and no one would care much. Thousands can starve to death each year, hundreds can die in civil war, despots can pillage the countryside, dictators and their armed thugs can rape, plunder and murder, regimes can strip the people of basic human rights, and the rest of you will do nothing. It is, you say, an internal problem. But when your interests are threatened there, when your investments, your security, your quality of life is on the line, you rally your nation. You try to rally your world behind you and rush in where angels fear to tread. You then tell the big lie, claiming you are doing what you are doing for humanitarian reasons, to help the oppressed peoples of the world, when the truth is you are simply protecting your own interests. The proof of this is that where you do not have interests, you do not have concern. He says the world's political machinery operates on self-interest. What else is new? Higher Perspective says something will have to be new if you wish your world to change. You must begin to see someone else's interests as your own. This will happen only when you reconstruct your global reality and govern yourselves accordingly. And he goes, are you talking about a one world government? And it says, I am. I would just like to add to that. This one world government is not a new world order. It's really a form of governance that's based on one. What we do to another, we do to ourselves. Your interests are my interests. If you're starving, that's my people starving. If you're a refugee, that could be me. I welcome you in. And in fact, the irony with refugees is those who are coming from the poorest countries. And we've seen this in humble people, that they will take you in no matter what you've done. I certainly know in Afghanistan, there was a custom there that even someone who had killed your family member, if they had asked for refuge, an Afghan would not say no. They would invite you in and they would feed you. You're a guest. Now that's an extraordinary thing. Ataturk, I was reading about how there was a memorial in Gallipoli where he called the Australian soldiers heroes and welcomed them being buried on their land. He showed great respect even though they were at war with one another, and that the Turks, they experienced far higher casualties. Yet there was a universal humanitarian response from Ataturk. And that really sunk very deeply into my heart as an Australian. It showed me the beauty of the Turkish people. In my own culture, I've seen the heroism of men and women here as pioneers, firstly, surviving in a very harsh land. But there was always a great sense of mateship here. And the larrikin is certainly in my memory. When I was growing up here in Australia, people laughed a lot and joked, mucked around. We didn't have the ambitions that you see today. People were having a lot of fun together back then. We knew our neighbours. We didn't plug into technology. We got out into nature. We too had a friendly sort of humanitarian, basis to our culture, perhaps emanating back from those convict days where we were oppressed. So this one world is really a shift in consciousness. It's not just a structure of government. It truly does come down to seeing ourselves in each other. And it really is for each person to deeply examine their values, to deeply examine what they are doing with their own lives, whether they're serving humanity or destroying humanity on the basis of their choices. I don't believe it holds that you can say, oh, well, it's just a job. I remember when I was invited to work for the CSIRO to commercialise scientific technology as a market analyst. I had $20 in my bank account. And I had to really deeply consider whether I was prepared to market technology that altered the DNA structure of molecules. So that's biotechnology. That's your GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Now, the week I was making the decision, my partner at the time was given a sculpture. It was a metal sculpture. If you can imagine a metal sculpture with all these different prongs, that's the way I describe it, all different heights with a twist at the end of each one. And what that was a plant structure with DNA at the end. It was coiled at the end. He was given it in the week I was to make my decision about the CSIRO. Now, this would have changed my life. I would have headed off down a career path. That was the real turning point in my career. It would have taken off. I was getting known as a market analyst in Canberra at that time. But when I examined my conscience, because I have to be in harmony with what actions I take, it's not good enough for me to say, oh, well, it's good money and it's a career. I don't wish to be lending my energy to anything that's going to cause harm to the planet. So I declined the invitation because I was offered the job. And of course, poverty has plagued my life ever since because I've had to make decisions from ethical perspectives. However, being on a lower income is received with gratitude because I've retained my dignity and integrity. And I value that far more than a $100,000 job. Because when I'm on my deathbed at the end of my life, I want to be able to say, I lived a life of integrity. I did what I felt was right in my life, and that I'm not leaving behind any regrets. I've done the best I can. Yes, I've made mistakes. I'm only human, but I have tried to live an ethical life from higher principles. That's not better than others. It's just living in harmony with what I see as our true nature. So my work at worldpeacefull.com, you can go there, is really the expression of choices I've made based on what I have felt inspired to do. Had I gone down the career path route based on money and prestige, I don't think I'd be the happy person I am today. I would far rather go through the challenges I've gone through and break through and develop these deeper insights into my own self and what life's about. I see that as a true wealth, and I knew at 28 that experience was the key to my life. And those are the doors I opened. I may not be popular, I may not have a partner, nor children, but I know within myself I made the right choices for me, and I am happy. So I'm going to leave you with what I've just shared for consideration. I think that higher perspective offers a pathway, and for people to really sit with what you're doing. If it is in harmony with who you are, go for it. If it's not, then you may want to consider changing direction, because our world is going to need all hands on deck if we're going to actualise harmony and peace on the planet, not as an idealistic notion, but as a possible future. Thank you for listening. You take care. Bye.